Joining me now is Labor MP for Kingsford Smith, Matt Thistlethwaite, and Liberal Senator for Victoria, Claire Chandler. Thank you so much, both of you, for joining us tonight.
G'day, Sharri.
Thanks for having me, Sharri.
Now, the Palace letters released yesterday, landmark case, they very clearly show that while John Kerr was raising the prospect of dismissal almost 2 months before November 11, 1975, the Queen did not know he was going to terminate the commission of the former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam before it happened. Matt, does this finally put to bed the conspiracy theories, or doesn't it?
Well, the thing about the Palace letters for me, Sharri, is that it's very clear that in the lead up to the dismissal, Sir John Kerr was regularly seeking assurances from the Palace about the action that he was potentially going to take in dismissing the government. And that's clear in the letter from Martin Charteris, the Queen's private secretary, to him on the 4th of November, where he outlines that the use of the reserve powers would be appropriate. So really, you're starting to get into the territory where Australia is having to seek assurances and consult a foreign power to make decisions about our democracy. And I don't think that that represents modern Australia. Now, that anomaly continues in our constitution today. And we've seen a recent example of that in 18 months ago. The Prime Minister had to contact Buckingham Palace to seek approval for the appointment of the next Governor-General of Australia. Now, surely we are mature enough as a country, we are independent enough as a country to run our own affairs and our own democracy and finally look at appointing one of our own as our head of state and becoming a republic.
What's your view, Claire? Do you think that, this is equivalent to consulting a foreign power for permission, or is this just a formality? Do you think this does strengthen the case for a republic?
Sharri, I think yesterday was a very important day for the history boffins to have these Palace papers revealed, but I was quite frankly confused why Anthony Albanese and the Labor Party decided that in the middle of a pandemic it was an appropriate time to hold a press conference and drag over history that's almost 50 years past now. I mean, that being said, I think the Australian Republican movement is trying to have a bob both ways with this issue of the Palace papers. In the lead up to their release, they were carrying on about how this was going to be the smoking gun that would demonstrate that Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth had intervened to dismiss their great hero of the left, Prime Minister Gough Whitlam, when really all the papers have demonstrated is that Sir John Kerr consulted with Buckingham Palace as appropriate and indeed acted independently and didn't actually feel the need to let the Queen know what he was doing beforehand. So I think it was entirely appropriate action for the time. And no, I don't think that we're going to see a resurgence in Australian republicanism as a result of the Palace Papers release. I just don't.
Matt, what Claire says is absolutely true. The bottom line is the Queen didn't know. But what do you think? I mean, it would be unthinkable today to terminate a prime ministership based on, supply being blocked and running out of money, wouldn't it?
Well, it's not unthinkable because it's still available for that to happen under our constitution. That's the great issue with what's been uncovered in the Palace papers over the past couple of days, that we haven't actually fixed that problem. We haven't come together as a nation to fix that difficulty that we have in our constitution where a recalcitrant opposition could still block supply and hold up government, and then you would have a Governor-General with a dilemma once again on whether or not to act, and to do that obviously would be in contact with the Palace.
So is this going to be a central theme of Labor's election policy during its next campaign?
Well,
becoming a republic?
I want to just respond to what Claire had to say a moment ago. The press conference that Anthony Albanese did yesterday, I was involved in that. That was principally about COVID. And we made the point of responding to the Palace letters because it had been an issue of the day. But that press conference was principally about COVID. And I made the point that we should begin a discussion, a mature discussion in Australia about a republic once we get through the difficulties of COVID. And I think it's not beyond
Matt,
us as a nation to have a look at that.
Matt, just back to my question. You are the Shadow Assistant Minister for the Republic. So is this going to be a central election campaign platform?
Well, it will be one of the platforms of the Labor Party's campaign and our policies leading up to the next election. In the Labor Party platform, we have support for Australia becoming a republic, and that will be an essential part of our platform moving forward. It's obviously not going to be a major issue in any election campaign, and I don't say that it is top of mind for most Australians. But what I do say is that I think that at some stage over the course of the next few years, once we get through COVID, we should be mature enough to begin a discussion about our constitutional arrangements and finally appointing one of our own as our head of state.
Yeah. Look, just turning to another topic, an opinion page editor and columnist at the New York Post, Bari Weiss, has issued a public resignation letter that's lifted the lid on the cancel culture at the New York Times. She's criticised its illiberal environment and claimed that she was subject to constant bullying by colleagues who disagreed with her views. Claire, how worried are you about powerful institutions like the New York Times when free discussion and speech is shut down in even a media organisation?
Look, you're entirely right, Sharri. It is very troubling to see what's happened at the New York Times and more broadly in terms of this cancel culture that seems to have taken a grip in our society. I mean, you only have to look at what happened to J.K. Rowling last month when she spoke out and made a very common sense view that biological women are women and biological men are men, and that there are certain sensible legal protections around those notions. But this cancel culture just seems to be taking over to the point that people feel that they can't express their own personal views anymore for fear of legal retribution. And I think that is incredibly troubling. I've always been a great advocate of free speech. And obviously part of being able to speak freely is also others having the freedom to criticise your ideas. That's part of what open and rigorous debate is all about. But what we're seeing in a lot of these institutions now, whether it's the media, whether it's corporate Australia, whether it's your bureaucracy, is this whole notion that people can be deplatformed just for saying things that most everyday people would agree with. It's absolutely troubling.
Absolutely. Matt, what do you think? Has centrist thinking, mainstream arguments given way to a pressure to conform to, quite radical left-wing views? And what's your response to the cancel culture that's taking hold?
Well, throughout history, there's always been the difficulty in balancing freedom of speech with ensuring that we're not unjustly offending certain groups and individuals. And obviously, we have laws that have developed through time to avoid that, particularly around racism, homophobia, around religious discrimination, and the like. Generally, I think in Australia, we get the balance right, and I think our laws are appropriate. I don't think that we should be going around bolus simply cancelling everything that may have offended someone in the past, but we need to make sure that where groups are offended by perhaps particular programs that aired in the past or actions in the past, that we try and work with those groups, understand what the offence is, and make sure that in the future we're trying to be a bit more sensitive about offending groups and individuals. So I think generally in Australia we do get the balance right.
Claire, have you ever felt this pressure as a parliamentarian not to express your views on certain topics?
Certainly not, Sharri. I'm in the very fortunate position where I have a platform available to me to speak my views on issues like this. And I agree with J.K. Rowling's view on women, certainly. And that has been one issue that I have been quite vocal on, talking about the issue of women's sport and it being for women. But I have, after speaking out about this issue, been approached by many women, both in Australia and overseas, who have said that they absolutely agree with my view, but they feel that they can't vocalise their own their agreement with my view or their own ideas about this issue for fear of retribution, which I just think is really, really upsetting, that women feel that they can't publicly say that women are women and that, there should be relevant protections and rights that come attached with that. It's very upsetting.
Matt, are women women and men men?
Well, I think that we all should have equal rights in Australia, and in past decades we've put in place measures to ensure that men and women have equal rights in Australian society, and that's what's important. There are areas within the way our economy works.
But do you think there is a biological difference? There are women and there are men, or do you think there are many different genders?
Well, I think what we need to do is make sure that we have laws that are appropriate, that respect the differences and respect people's sensibilities about those issues. And
but what do you think?
Generally,
what do you think? Do you think?
Well, generally in Australia, I'm happy with the way that the laws operate in Australia at the moment, particularly the laws around discrimination.
But in terms of genders, do you think there are just two genders, or are there more than two genders?
Well, certainly under Australian law, the way it's been moving, there is that ability for people to identify as non-gender, and that's appropriate under Australian law. But what I think is important is making sure that we have laws that are appropriate and get the balance right. And generally in Australia, I think we've been able to achieve that.
Look, there's now serious concerns now that the outbreak in Victoria of coronavirus has spread to New South Wales. We've heard that today. It has spread to New South Wales. Claire, how badly do you think the Victorian government has handled this outbreak? And do you think Australians right across the country would have the right to be furious at the Andrews government?
Look, I think what we're seeing playing out in Victoria is certainly understandably very troubling for a lot of Australians. We've all worked incredibly hard to try and get the coronavirus under control, at least from a health perspective. And seeing what's playing out in Victoria, like I say, it would be very upsetting, particularly for everybody that has done the right thing. But, I mean, we just need to be working as hard as we possibly can to test as many people as we can and trace this virus so that we can try and get this wave under control. I mean, particularly for my constituents back in Tasmania, we've been watching what's been playing out in Melbourne very closely. We know that Melbourne is one of our most important tourist entry points, and so it is really troubling what we're seeing play out there and the impact that has had on our ability as a state to open our borders as well. So, yes, certainly looking at everything that is happening in Victoria with great interest, and I can understand why Australians across the country would be concerned by what they're seeing in Melbourne.
Matt Thistlethwaite, do you think it was a mistake for New South Wales Premier Gladys Berejiklian to open the borders? Do you think had they been shut to Victoria, we might not be experiencing this outbreak now?
Well, I've been saying all along, Sharri, that our premiers and the Prime Minister should act on medical advice and the advice of epidemiologists. And to date, we've had differences in states based on the different scenarios that they're facing in terms of infection rates in those states. And I think broadly, most Australian states' premiers have operated within the bounds of that medical advice, and that's the important thing. When the outbreaks occurred, the epidemiologists and the medical professionals said, look, we'll eventually flatten the curve, but we're going to have outbreaks, and they're going to be spot outbreaks in certain areas. We had one in northern Tasmania.
Sure, but there's a high number of incidents in Victoria have been linked to not having proper security protocols around those hotel quarantines because of the private contractors who were used rather than defence personnel and police. So that was clearly a mistake. That's been identified objectively as a mistake. So, you know, do you accept that that was an issue, and also that had New South Wales kept the border closed to Victoria, we might not be facing a second wave here?
There have been mistakes that have been made. The Ruby Princess debacle was a huge mistake that led to a number of deaths and infections. But what's important, Sharri, is that we learn from those mistakes and put in place measures to ensure that they don't occur again in the future, and we do our best to reduce the rate of infection. And I think the best approach for that is to make sure that we're all working together and that we're communicating with each other and making sure that we accept the advice of those medical experts to make sure that when there are outbreaks, we deal with them as quickly as possible.
Right. We're going to have to leave it there. Claire Chandler, Matt Thistlethwaite, thank you both very much for your time.
Thanks, Sharri.
Thanks, Sharri.